This is lecture number 11 in the cardio series, and it's actually the final, or the last lecture of the cardiac series. There's more to say, of course, because it's a cardiovascular system, so there's a lot more to say about blood vessels and blood pressure and things like that, but that's going to be kind of in a separate series. And this one is fun. I like this one because we look at the neural regulation of cardiac output. I'm strongly biased, just my personal take, when I think about physiology, I want to know who's making that happen, who's in charge, who told you to do that. And so I think that's kind of a natural, maybe default state of mind or way of thinking for a lot of us. A lot of times when something goes wrong, if you're at the DMV and somebody messes up, we always want to know, well, who's your boss? Who else can I talk to? If you're at a store and there's bad service, or you're at a restaurant or something, or if there's great service, we want to know, hey, who's your boss? So I can tell your boss what a great job you did. So this idea of who are the regulators, who's in charge of this, is I think a very critical concept in physiology. And so in this one, we're going to look at the neural regulation of cardiac output. Previously, we looked at, what is cardiac output? It's the amount of blood moved per unit of time. And our question now is that, okay, that's cool. I get that. I get that there's this thing called stroke volume and heart rate. But who's in charge of that, right? So that's what we get into here. And then this number two learning objective is pretty simple and straightforward, at least the way I'm going to cover it. So we're just going to look at the major blood vessels of the heart. Learning objective number 1 and learning objective number 2 don't necessarily kind of flow together nice and cleanly, but I had to stick learning objective 2 somewhere, so I stuck it here. So let's look at this thing. We've got this thing in the medulla, and yeah, I said medulla because we're looking at the neural regulation of cardiac output. And so, of course, we got to talk about neural tissue. So remember, the lowest part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. And in the medulla, when you guys study the nervous system, you probably learned, very kind of generally that there's the lower brainstem regulates, quote unquote, vital functions like respiration, cardiovascular function, and things like that. And it's true, there are networks of interneurons and a whole bunch of different nuclei there. Remember that nuclei are collections of cell bodies in the central nervous system. And they live in this kind of pontomedullary region, and certain clusters of those we call the cardiovascular control centers. And this is really where central regulation of cardiovascular function happens. Now, there definitely is suprasegmental or higher brain input into those regions, as you can see by these blue lines. There's higher brain centers that are going to did I say feed put? That's a weird term. They're going to input into the cardiovascular control centers, but ultimately the kind of direct signals that go to the heart are going to be coming from the cardiovascular control centers. So let's look at these things. What input to the cardiovascular control centers? Well, we got input from higher brain centers, things like the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, the hypothalamus. Let's stop and make those things make sense. Can you sit there right now, right? If let me finish this sentence or a couple sentences, and you can pause the video and try it. And can you think about something? Your cerebral cortex is working. Can you think and imagine something, and all of a sudden your heart rate changes? Maybe you're thinking about someone you love that you can't wait to see, and so now your heart starts going faster. Or maybe you're thinking about some really visceral experience that you've had recently that you got to deal with, some problem in your life, and it stresses you out, and you can feel your blood pressure rising. So certainly higher brain centers are going to feed right into that. Let's think of the limbic system. If we just take kind of one of the most famous parts, the amygdala, the alarm center, if something's, a big giant rat or a big giant tiger like steps out in front of you and you start freaking out all of a sudden, you get this big amygdala response. So do you see some effect in the heart when that occurs? And certainly you do. And these are, again, just examples that higher brain centers are going to feed into the cardiovascular control centers. What about the hypothalamus? Well, with the hypothalamus, if you remember from the endocrine system, it's the king of the endocrine system and king, ultimately, of the autonomic nervous system. So certainly it's going to have input into the cardiovascular centers. Okay, what about other things besides higher brain centers? This is kind of cool. From proprioceptors, from different mechanoreceptors out there that are going to be responsible for proprioception. So those things are going to feed back to the cardiovascular control centers. So let's take something like, joint capsule mechanoreceptors. So as your hip, your hip is surrounded by this massive joint capsule, and as it starts moving because you're walking, those signals are coming up to the brain to saying, hey, I want to let you know that I'm moving here. I want to let you know that we're ambulatory, and so stuff is happening. And so what you're really telling the nervous system is that, hey, I'm moving, so make sure you autonomic nervous system, as as fundamentally as you are a fuel delivery system, could you please make sure I get enough fuel since I'm moving? And so it makes good sense that you're going to feed back in the cardiovascular control centers, chemoreceptors, baroreceptors, etc. Now, what about the output? The output are coming through the sympathetic neuron and the vagus nerve. Remember from the nervous system that the vagus nerve, kind of the standard kind of textbook line is the vagus nerve carries 75% of the parasympathetic output from the central nervous system. So there's vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. And so you got sympathetic neurons and parasympathetic neurons coming out from here. I think I should take that sentence back. You do have sympathetic. Darn it. Let me try that one more time. You have parasympathetic neurons coming out from here through the vagus nerve, and the sympathetic neurons, if you recall, they're really coming out from the thoracolumbar regions of the spine. So the cardiovascular control centers has descending input through the medulla, through the upper part of the spinal cord to get into those thoracolumbar regions that have the preganglionic sympathetic neurons. Okay, in any case, there's that. All right. I'm pulling up this slide here to remind you that we're looking at autorhythmic cells here. So if you look at autorhythmic cells, remember SA node, I'm not going to rehash the sodium, potassium, and all that kind of stuff. But here's what I'm going to say. If you look at time on the x-axis, is it reasonable that sometimes instead of having 2 peaks within this window of time, you might want 3 peaks? And what I mean by that is, do you sometimes want to increase the rate of depolarization? Certainly you do. What am I saying in English? I'm saying, do you ever want to increase heart rate? Yeah, you do. Well, if you're going to increase heart rate, you darn well better increase the rate of depolarization of the SA node. And so can the cardiovascular control center, through sympathetic output, increase the rate of spontaneous depolarization of the SA node to increase heart rate? Yes, you can. Absolutely. Now let's look at the other one. Can you increase contractility of the myocardium to increase stroke volume? Look, hopefully you're picking up on these words that I'm saying. Heart rate, stroke volume, heart rate, stroke volume. Where have we seen that before? Cardiac output is made up of heart rate and stroke volume. Can you increase heart rate? Yep. Can you increase stroke volume? Yep. How do you do that? You do that through sympathetic output. On the other hand, can you decrease those things? Yes, you do that through parasympathetic output. Now, if you look here, you decrease rate of depolarization of the SA node. What are you not seeing? You are not seeing another arrow splitting off here that says decreased contractility of atrium ventricles, decreasing stroke volume. You're not seeing that. That's important to know. Now, let's look at a picture. If you look at this next picture, look at what we have here. We have the SA node, we have the AV node, and I'm just going to say ventricular myocardium for now. Yes, there's atrial myocardium, but let me just focus on the ventricular myocardium. So if we look at the vagus nerve, there's the parasympathetics. The vagus nerve comes out of the medulla, and as he comes out, he will directly innervate the SA node and the AV node. He does not go on and innervate the ventricular myocardium. And this is why we see here that the cranial nerve, vagus nerve, is only going to decrease rate of depolarization of the SA node and AV node. But we don't see that separate line to impact contractility, because, true or false, the vagus nerve directly innervates the ventricular myocardium. False. True or false, the vagus nerve can directly decrease contractility and therefore stroke volume. The answer is false. So therefore, the vagus nerve, true or false, can only impact heart rate. Let me say it differently. If we go back here, the vagus nerve can only influence heart rate. It cannot directly influence stroke volume. Hopefully you hear my emphasis on the word directly influence stroke volume. Can it indirectly do so? Yeah, it can, but it does not directly do so. Let me say that again. Can the vagus nerve indirectly impact stroke volume? I take it back. The answer is no. But can the parasympathetic nervous system indirectly impact stroke volume? The answer there is yes. And what I mean by that is this. Look, the parasympathetic nervous system, again, it lives here, but remember that when and you got to go back to what you know about ANS already, is that, yeah, the vagus nerve carries stuff out, but again, the parasympathetic neurons sitting right here in the medulla have descending input onto those thoracolumbar regions to decrease output of the sympathetics. So through that, they can indirectly impact contractility, but directly, they don't have any meaningful effect. Okay? Okay, let's go into the sympathetics then. What do the sympathetics do? Again, here we are at the thoracolumbar. Well, here it says thoracic spinal cord. Remember that in that kind of a lateral horn, that's where the preganglionic sympathetics emanate or originate, and they go out through the ventral root, come into that sympathetic chain. They find the postganglionic sympathetic neuron right over there. These guys then go out, go to SA node, AV node, and the myocardium, ventricular myocardium. So therefore, ready? True or false? The sympathetics impact heart rate. Let me go back here. The sympathetics impact heart rate directly. Yep, they sure do by dumping on the SAAV nodes. True or false? The sympathetics impact stroke volume? Yeah, man, 100% because they directly innervate the ventricular myocardium. All right, so this distinction is pretty important to recognize. All right, now what do they do? How do they do that? So I've got this, I guess it's not a table. I got this slide here saying, what do the sympathetics do to the SA node and AV node? They increase sodium and calcium permeability. Okay, these are influencing, or they're increasing permeability of those cells to sodium and calcium. Now, if you go back here, let's just look at SA node. If you increase permeability of sodium and calcium, then the slope of these lines is actually going to increase, right? It's going to be a much steeper slope here if you get leakier to sodium, and it's going to be a steeper slope here if you get leakier to calcium. And the steeper the slope, the faster you're depolarizing, the faster you can eventually repolarize and then do it all over again. So that's why sympathetics will increase sodium and calcium permeability. Now, what do they do to the ventricular myocardium? They're going to increase calcium availability within the myocardium. And I showed you that previously in a picture like this. We saw that the sympathetics through norepinephrine are going to allow you to increase the release of calcium from that sarcoplasmic reticulum. Remember, there's SR where calcium is stored and released. And then if you increase the amount of calcium that you dump out per electrical signal, then you've got more calciums binding to more troponins, and if more troponins are doing their thing, the more that actin-myosin interaction can occur. And again, this is going back to the sliding filament model that we've seen back when you did the skeletal muscle. I know I didn't rehash it for cardiac muscle, but it's largely the same, so therefore, in my mind, it's not necessary to rehash, as long as we understand it still involves troponin and actin and myosin. Okay. Then, what do the parasympathetics do? Well, the parasympathetics will do just the opposite. The parasympathetics will go to the SA node, and they're going to increase potassium permeability, and that's going to decrease rate of depolarization. And I know there's some lack of intuition here because we're thinking decrease potassium permeability, potassium channels open here. But what ends up happening is even at rest, remember there's some leakage channels here. Maybe you don't remember, but there's always going to be leakage channels all over the place. And so the more you can increase potassium permeability, the less the slope of this line is going to be. So that's why you're going to decrease potassium permeability. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. That's why you're going to increase potassium permeability, which makes it harder to depolarize the SA node, which is going to slow down the rate of depolarization. Okay, I hope you caught all that. With the AV node, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to increase potassium permeability, and that will then again decrease the rate of depolarization. I wrote in here in purple, or whatever color this is, that on the ventricular myocardium, there's no direct effect. But does the vagus nerve have an indirect effect on myocardium? And this is what, again, I think as I was talking it out, I realized this is probably poorly stated. We shouldn't say that. The vagus nerve does not have an indirect effect. What has an indirect effect? It's the parasympathetic nervous system at the level of the brainstem. That has an indirect effect on the myocardium by, again, sending neurons through that lower part of the brainstem, in through the cervical spine, in towards that upper thoracolumbar region, therefore, firing IPSPs, inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, on these preganglionic sympathetic neurons. All right. Nope. Here we are. So this is a nice slide. I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time talking it out, but I would encourage you to pause the video and spend some time looking at it because it's a nice little summary here. What we have here, this guy playing soccer, and we have an increase in cardiac output. Well, what are those things that increase cardiac output? I know I'm a broken record here, but what are they? Heart rate and stroke volume. So what we're looking at here there are things that you can do to increase stroke volume. You can do any of these things. What can you do to increase heart rate? You can do any of these things. These are all variables that impact stroke volume. These are all variables that impact heart rate. There definitely is going to be a lot of overlap, meaning that if you're going to influence one of these things, very likely you're going to influence other things. I will talk about that maybe later on in the blood pressure section. But what I want you to see for now is that you've got different things that can impact stroke volume, thereby changing cardiac output. You've got different things that can impact heart rate, thereby changing cardiac output. All right, so that wraps up the neuroregulation of cardiac output. Now, the last, again, kind of miscellaneous concept, like I said, just kind of throwing it in here, are naming the major blood vessels of the heart. So, you know, for my students in my course, I'm probably a little bit lighter on this. If you are a student in another course watching this video, then definitely go with what your professor or your teacher is guiding you through. The main thing that I want my students to know is this. In terms of the arterial supply, we've got a right coronary artery and left coronary artery. And what I want to point out is this. This guy right here is the aorta. And later, we're going to name some of these pipes that come off the aorta, like the brachiocephalic trunk, and then the common carotid, and subclavian, and things like that. But what I want you to see is that this pipe is coming out of the left ventricle. The very first set of pipes that comes out of the left ventricle are the right and left coronary arteries. Now, this is a big thing to notice because here's the thing. The heart, obviously, in the left atrium has oxygenated blood. In the left ventricle, you have oxygenated blood. But what the heart is not permitted to do is to directly take oxygen from those chambers. So here's what I mean by that. If you look here, there's the left atrium, again, receiving freshly oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins, and there's the left ventricle. Well, what I want you to see is that these cardiac muscle cells, right, these cells right here are not allowed to eat the oxygen in here directly. They don't get to do that. They got to get in line just like everybody else. And what I mean by that is I like Chipotle. At the time of this video, I really enjoy Chipotle, and when you go to Chipotle, you stand in line and the people, put in rice and then lettuce and beans and whatever else on your thing. Well, what I want you to imagine then is that those people in line at Chipotle who are serving you, when it's time for their lunch break, they don't just whip out a spoon and then just start eating from that big, huge tray of rice. They don't get to do that. A lot of times they'll get in line just like everybody else, and then one of their coworkers will put together their burrito or their bowl or whatever. Similarly, the left atrium can't just steal oxygen from whatever's in here. Same thing with the left ventricle. They get in line. And so what ends up happening is that the first pipe that leaves, not first, the only pipe that leaves the left ventricle is this aorta. And then from there, again, they get in line. But who are the first people in line? It's the heart. Because look, right as you leave from the aorta, the very first blood vessels to leave are the right and left coronary arteries. And what do these do? These supply blood, oxygenated blood to the heart. So one more time, I know there's oxygenated blood in the left atrium and left ventricle, but you don't get to use. The left atrium does not get to eat from there. The left atrium gets its own blood supply from the left coronary artery. Okay, that's important to note. So now, there's other arteries, because you'll see the right and left coronary arteries are going to branch out and make all sorts of things, and they also kind of make connections together. This anastomosis is where these different blood vessels come together. Again, not such a big deal for my students. I simply want you to be aware of this idea that there's blood vessels do hook up in all sorts of cool ways. The main things that I want you to think of are the right coronary artery feeds the right side of the heart, left coronary artery feeds the left side of the heart. And let's say that with kind of an asterisk and a wink wink. The right coronary artery, yeah, it feeds the right side of the heart, but because of all these connections and branching, there's some that go to the left side. The left coronary artery feeds the left side of the heart, but because of all the branches and then, the anastomoses and stuff, some of that feeds the right side. So, but to keep it simple, the whole keep it simple, stupid principle, we're going to say the right coronary artery feeds the right side, left coronary artery feeds the left side, okay? Now, that's it for arteries. What about veins? Well, one of the big fat veins that you've already heard of is the coronary sinus, and all I want you to know is that the coronary sinus is kind of the ultimate dumping point for deoxygenated blood at the heart. And then where does the coronary sinus go? You know that already. It returns back into the right atrium. Remember that going into the right atrium, we saw the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus, again, is receiving blood from the heart, receiving deoxygenated blood from the rest of the heart. All right, so that's it for the vasculature of the heart. Let's see. We described the neuroregulation of cardiac output. We named the major blood vessels of the heart, at least to the extent that I want my students to know them. And I believe that should do it. We're done with the heart. The next series will go into blood vessels.